The Italian front during World War I was a place of brutal struggle, where soldiers fought not only against enemy forces, but also against the unforgiving elements of nature. One of the most dangerous and unexpected enemies in the Alps was the snow. In the winter of 1916, the snowstorms in the Dolomite Mountains created deadly conditions for the soldiers stationed there. As the cold winter deepened, the snow began to pile up at alarming rates. By the beginning of December, snowdrifts in the region reached up to 10 feet, blocking roads, cutting off supply lines, and making movement nearly impossible. The Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies were both entrenched in these mountains, locked in a desperate struggle, where both sides faced not only gunfire but also the crushing weight of the snow and ice. The men in these remote mountain positions were ill-equipped to handle such extreme cold. Most soldiers wore clothing that offered little protection against frostbite and hypothermia, leaving them vulnerable to the bitter chill that could freeze their bodies in an instant. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians living in the foothills of the mountains were equally at risk. Whole villages were isolated, cut off by snow-blocked roads with no access to medical care or food supplies. The conditions were so harsh that soldiers sometimes froze to death in their foxholes, unable to protect themselves from the cold. Others were left stranded for days without proper supplies, as heavy snowfalls blocked any attempts to bring in more resources. The isolation was not just physical, but psychological as well. These men were stuck in an environment that seemed to work against them at every turn. Every moment of every day felt like a struggle for survival. In the middle of these harsh conditions, a deadly force was quietly building up in the snow-packed mountains. The Dolomites, with their steep slopes and unpredictable weather, were a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The snow had been accumulating for weeks, and with each new storm, the snowpacks became more unstable. With temperatures fluctuating wildly between freezing cold and brief thaws, the conditions were perfect for an avalanche. Avalanches were nothing new in the mountains, but no one could have anticipated the scale of destruction that would be unleashed on December 13th of 1916. It's not entirely clear why or how the avalanches happened that day, but many factors contributed. Some reports suggest that the snowpacks had been weakened by shelling. Both sides were so desperate to bury their enemies that they may have fired shells at the snow in an attempt to trigger an avalanche, though no one can say for certain how much this contributed to the event. What is known is that the avalanches came suddenly, without warning, and with terrifying force. The day of the avalanches has since been remembered as White Friday, despite the fact that it took place on a Wednesday. The term was coined because the disaster was so horrific that it became a day marked in history. For those who lived through it, however, the memory of that day was forever tied to chaos, fear, and unimaginable loss. As we will see, the scale of destruction that followed was unlike anything the soldiers had prepared for, but the full extent of the tragedy would not become clear until much later. The soldiers and civilians trapped in the avalanche's path were left to deal with the aftermath in ways that few had ever experienced before. As the morning of December 13th, 1916 dawned over the Dolomites, no one could have predicted the disaster that was about to strike. The soldiers stationed in the mountain barracks had grown used to the harsh conditions, but even they couldn't have been prepared for what nature was about to unleash. The Austro-Hungarian barracks on Mount Marmolada, one of the most significant targets during the conflict, sat at nearly 11,000 feet above sea level. Built in the summer of 1916, the barracks had been strategically placed atop the Grand Pose summit, out of reach from high-angle mortar fire and in a location that seemed secure from attack. But despite the location's strategic advantages, the barracks were vulnerable to something far more deadly than the enemy artillery: avalanches. The snow, which had been accumulating for weeks, had reached dangerous depths. In the days leading up to the avalanche, the weather had been erratic. The sudden thaw that had followed a period of heavy snowfall only weakened the snowpacks further, making them ripe for disaster. While the soldiers were preoccupied with the ongoing war and the cold, they weren't aware that the snow was on the verge of collapse. The Austro-Hungarian commander, Captain Rudolf Schmid, recognized the growing danger. He feared the snow was becoming unstable and that his position would soon become untenable. On December 9th, Captain Schmid sent a request to his superior, Field Marshal Lieutenant Ludwig Geuginger, asking to vacate the barracks before disaster struck. However, his request was denied and his unit was left in place. It wasn't just the soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian barracks who were at risk. The Italian divisions positioned in the mountains were equally vulnerable. While the Austro-Hungarians had made some attempts to prepare for the worst, the Italians had no such plans in place. Their soldiers were spread out along the peaks and valleys, unaware that the snow in the higher altitudes was becoming a ticking time bomb. As the day wore on, the conditions in the mountains only worsened. Heavy snow continued to fall, and by the time the sun began to set, the unstable snowpack on Mount Marmolada was on the verge of collapse. The soldiers, who had been working in freezing temperatures for days on end, now faced the full force of nature's wrath. What they didn't know was that the avalanche was only moments away. When the avalanche finally hit, it came down with an overwhelming force. It swept across the mountainside, overwhelming everything in its path. The snow came crashing down so violently that it seemed like the entire mountain was shaking. The barracks on Mount Marmolada were directly in the path of the avalanche, and within moments, the entire structure was buried beneath tons of snow. The force of the avalanche was so strong that it not only buried the barracks, but also destroyed everything around it. The soldiers who had been stationed there had no chance to escape. The avalanche didn't stop there. In fact, it was just the first of several that would strike on that fateful day. The snow continued to fall, and avalanches triggered by the unstable snowpack would hit other areas, including Italian positions and other Austro-Hungarian sites. The destruction was catastrophic, with hundreds of men buried alive beneath the snow. The impact was immediate and devastating. The soldiers, caught off guard by the avalanche's power, struggled to dig their comrades out from beneath the snow, but time was against them. The snow was too deep and the wreckage too vast. By the end of the day, the full scale of the tragedy had begun to reveal itself. Hundreds of soldiers had been killed or trapped, and the avalanche's impact had spread far beyond Mount Marmolada. The snow, which had once seemed like a silent enemy, had become a violent and unrelenting force, taking the lives of thousands. The death toll was not fully realized in the immediate aftermath, but estimates suggest that the total number of casualties, including those who died in subsequent avalanches, may have been in the thousands. For those who survived, the sense of chaos and terror was overwhelming. They were left to dig through the snow, searching for any sign of life among the wreckage. As the survivors tried to recover from the disaster, the snowstorms continued, making any rescue efforts almost impossible. And while the snow continued to fall, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. The avalanche that had struck on December 13th was one of the worst in history, marking a devastating chapter in the story of the Italian front during World War I. But for those trapped in the mountains, the battle for survival had just begun. The aftermath of the White Friday avalanches was nothing short of horrific. As December 13th, 1916 drew to a close, the full extent of the devastation slowly began to emerge. What had started as an ordinary winter's day on the Italian front quickly escalated into one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. In the wake of the avalanches, the landscape had been completely transformed. The once pristine mountains of the Dolomites were now a chaotic, treacherous sight. The snow had buried everything in its path, buildings, equipment, and men, leaving the soldiers and civilians trapped under tons of snow and debris. Entire units had been wiped out, and those who survived found themselves in an unimaginable situation. The search for survivors was a desperate and grueling task. Rescue operations were nearly impossible in the immediate aftermath. The snow was too deep, the conditions too dangerous, and the cold too intense. Those who survived the initial wave of avalanches were left to dig through the snow, searching for any signs of life among the wreckage. But with no tools and limited resources, the chances of finding anyone alive seemed slim. The soldiers who had been stationed at the barracks on Mount Marmolada had no time to prepare. They were buried under snow so quickly that many didn't even have the chance to flee. Even for those who managed to survive the initial avalanche, the struggle for life had only just begun. The freezing temperatures and lack of supplies made survival increasingly difficult as the hours passed. Hypothermia set in quickly, and many soldiers, trapped under the snow, slowly succumbed to the cold. It wasn't just the soldiers in the immediate vicinity of Mount Marmolada who were affected. Other Italian and Austro-Hungarian positions further down the front were also struck by avalanches on the same day. As the snow swept down the mountainsides, entire companies were swept away. The devastation was widespread, affecting both sides of the conflict. The chaos was compounded by the heavy snowfall and the ongoing risk of additional avalanches. No one was safe from nature's fury. The terror didn't end with the initial avalanche. After the first wave hit, additional avalanches continued to fall throughout the region, catching more men off guard. While some soldiers were able to escape the worst of the disaster, many found themselves trapped under piles of snow, struggling to breathe and find their bearings. They faced the relentless onslaught of snow and ice, each moment feeling like a battle for survival. The snowstorms that had caused the avalanches showed no signs of letting up, and the constant threat of more avalanches loomed over the soldiers. Visibility was reduced to nearly nothing, and in the thick, heavy snow, any attempt at a coordinated rescue was futile. The soldiers who had been caught in the disaster were left to rely on their instincts, digging through the snow with bare hands, hoping to find any sign of life. In addition to the avalanche's physical toll, the emotional strain on the soldiers was immense. They were not only fighting against the elements, but also dealing with the shock of losing comrades. The cries for help could be heard in the distance, but with no way to reach the trapped soldiers in time, the helplessness was overwhelming. For many, the scene was one of total chaos. Soldiers frantically searching for survivors, while others succumbed to the cold and the weight of the snow. The total number of casualties was impossible to determine in the immediate aftermath, as so many soldiers were still missing or buried under the snow. Estimates later placed the death toll at over 2,000 soldiers, with some accounts suggesting that the number could be much higher. Civilian casualties, though fewer, also added to the tragedy as the avalanches devastated nearby towns and villages. It wasn't just the soldiers who paid the price for nature's fury. The surrounding civilian population also suffered, trapped by the same snowstorm that claimed the soldiers' lives. In the days following the avalanche, the full scale of the disaster continued to unfold. With no clear way to communicate and supplies running low, it became evident that this wasn't just an isolated tragedy. It was a turning point in the war itself. The avalanche had wiped out significant portions of the Austro-Hungarian and Italian forces, forcing both sides to regroup and rethink their strategies. While the avalanches may have been caused by natural forces, the devastation they caused was made worse by the circumstances of the war. The soldiers, already weakened by months of fighting in the harsh winter conditions, were now facing an even more insidious enemy, nature itself. The avalanche, like the war, showed no mercy, and its consequences would ripple through the lives of all who were affected for years to come. The White Friday avalanches were a stark reminder of the unpredictability of nature and the power it holds over the course of human history. While the soldiers on the front lines fought bravely against the enemy, they could not have predicted that nature itself would be their greatest adversary. For those who lived through the avalanche, the memories of that terrible day would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And for the families of the soldiers who perished, the pain of loss would linger, never truly fading. The consequences of the White Friday avalanches weren't just felt in the immediate aftermath, but stretched on for weeks, months, and even years. The scale of the disaster left deep scars, both physical and emotional, on the soldiers, civilians, and the wider region. The destruction of entire military units and the loss of so many lives served as a grim reminder of how nature can reshape the course of history, especially in the midst of war. In the aftermath of December 13, 1916, both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces had to reevaluate their positions. Entire divisions had been wiped out in the avalanches, and the war effort was severely impacted. The men who survived found themselves not only grappling with the loss of comrades, but also trying to make sense of how such a catastrophe could occur. The snow, which had been a silent and ever-present force in the mountains, had suddenly become a terrifying enemy. The surviving soldiers were forced to deal with the physical toll of the avalanche. Many had been trapped under tons of snow for hours, some even longer, before they were rescued. They were frostbitten, exhausted, and traumatized, often suffering from injuries sustained during the avalanche. The freezing temperatures and lack of proper medical supplies made their recovery slow and painful. Even those who had escaped the avalanche with relatively minor injuries were left mentally scarred, haunted by the memories of that day. The emotional trauma was equally devastating. Those who had survived found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of their former comrades and struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the loss. Many soldiers had spent months on the front lines, enduring grueling conditions, but nothing could have prepared them for the horrors of the avalanche. The cries for help, the sight of men being buried alive in snow, and the chaos of trying to rescue the trapped, all of these elements would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On the civilian side, the situation was just as dire. Entire villages and towns had been cut off by the snow, and many residents found themselves without basic necessities. The avalanches not only disrupted military operations, but also led to a breakdown in the local infrastructure. Roads were blocked and communication lines were severed. The civilians who lived in the areas surrounding the Dolomites were left to fend for themselves, facing the same brutal conditions as the soldiers. As the recovery effort began, it became clear just how massive the damage was. The avalanche had affected both sides of the conflict, with the total number of casualties reaching into the thousands. But the true scale of the destruction was not immediately apparent. In many areas, rescue teams struggled to reach the buried soldiers and civilians. The snow was simply too deep, and the risk of further avalanches kept many teams from venturing into the worst-hit areas. Those who were trapped under the snow had little hope of survival without immediate help. Over time, some of the survivors were able to make their way out of the disaster zones, though they were often in poor condition. As news of the avalanche spread, the rest of the world began to learn of the tragedy. The incident became known as the White Friday Avalanches, and it was soon clear that it was one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. While the conflict of World War I continued to rage, the memory of the avalanches remained an ever-present shadow, reminding those who survived just how fragile life can be in the face of nature's fury. In the years that followed, the effects of the disaster would continue to reverberate. The loss of so many soldiers impacted both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces in ways that were hard to quantify. Many of the men who survived the avalanches were physically and mentally broken, and they struggled to continue their military duties. Some would later be sent to different fronts or even return home, unable to carry on in the same capacity. The avalanches of December 13, 1916, didn't just change the lives of those directly affected. They were a stark reminder to future generations about the power of nature and the unpredictable ways it can alter the course of human history. As the survivors moved on with their lives, many chose to honor the memory of their fallen comrades, and the event itself would be remembered annually, marked by a somber observance on St. Lucy's Day. Yet for those who had been caught in the path of the avalanche, it remained a haunting memory of nature's merciless hand in a time of war. As we reflect on the events of White Friday, it's essential to remember that the disaster wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a turning point in the way both soldiers and civilians interacted with the harsh alpine landscape. It serves as a reminder that nature can be as unpredictable and devastating as any enemy army, and that the forces of the natural world must never be underestimated. The White Friday avalanches of December 13, 1916, remain one of the most devastating natural disasters to ever strike during a time of war. The tragic events not only left a lasting mark on the soldiers and civilians caught in their path, but they also changed the way avalanches were understood and handled in the future. What began as a bitter winter turned into one of the deadliest days in the history of avalanches, and the impact would be felt long after the snow had settled. In the aftermath, the full scale of the disaster gradually came into focus. The death toll was staggering, with thousands of soldiers and civilians lost in the snow. The grief was immeasurable, as entire units and villages were wiped out in a matter of hours. But alongside the devastation, there were also stories of incredible survival. Those who had managed to escape the avalanches found themselves dealing with injuries, trauma, and the overwhelming sense of loss. For many, the memory of that day would never leave them, serving as a constant reminder of how quickly life can change when nature unleashes its fury. In the years following the disaster, the White Friday avalanches would be remembered not only as a military tragedy, but also as a cautionary tale about the unpredictable power of the natural world. For those who lived through it, the memory of the avalanche's terrifying roar and the deafening silence that followed was something they could never forget. The soldiers who survived would carry the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives, and their stories became an integral part of the history of World War I. Efforts to rebuild after the disaster were slow and difficult. In many areas, the damage to infrastructure was so severe that it took years for normal life to resume. But even as the physical landscape was repaired, the emotional toll on the survivors and the families of the fallen would never fully heal. In time, the event would be commemorated every year on St. Lucy's Day, not just as a way of remembering the loss of life, but as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of such unimaginable devastation. The White Friday avalanches of 1916 may have been a tragedy, but they also served as a reminder of the unpredictable and often uncontrollable forces of nature. They taught us that no matter how advanced our technology or how strong our will, we are still at the mercy of the natural world. And in this case, The avalanche reminded everyone involved in that brutal war that no matter how hard the human spirit fights, nature itself can be the ultimate victor. As we reflect on this terrible moment in history, it's crucial to honor the memory of those who perished in the snow, whether they were soldiers, civilians, or anyone caught in the avalanche's path. Their sacrifices, both on the battlefield and in the face of nature's wrath, should never be forgotten. And as we continue to study the lessons of the White Friday avalanches, we are reminded once again that nature, in all its beauty and danger, remains one of the most powerful forces on Earth. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the past as we uncovered the chilling history of the White Friday avalanches. If you have any thoughts or reflections on this story, feel free to share them in the comments, and be sure to check out more historical stories as we continue to explore the moments that shaped our world